I never told my son. I make $80,000 a month. His wife screamed, "Get out, you beggar! We don't need you!" My son threw my things out the door. A month later, I bought the house across the street. When he saw my name on the deed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I was 68 years old when my son threw my suitcase onto the front porch like it was a bag of old newspapers. But let me start before that night. Let me start where things still felt, at least on the surface, like family. I had spent the better part of my adult life building something quietly. After my husband Harold passed, God rest him, I was 51 years old, alone in our house in Boise, Idaho, with a mortgage, a garden, and absolutely no intention of sitting down and grieving myself to death. Harold had been a careful man, a saver, and he left me with a foundation. I built the rest myself. I started with an online resale business, vintage furniture, estate finds, things people threw away that still had life in them. Then I expanded into digital consulting for small antique dealers who had no idea how to sell online. By the time I was 65, I was earning close to $80,000 a month. Not a year. A month. I never told anyone. Not my neighbors. Not my church friends. And certainly not my son Daniel. I want to be clear about why. Harold always said, "Money changes the people around you before it changes you." I had watched it happen to his sister when she inherited their mother's estate. I didn't want to be looked at differently. I didn't want to be a wallet with a grandmother's face. So I lived modestly. I drove a 2017 Honda CR-V. I wore clothes from Costco and the occasional splurge at Chico's. My house in Boise was paid off, simple and full of plants. Daniel was my only child. We were close, or I believed we were close, until he married Brittany Caldwell 4 years ago. Brittany was 34, 12 years younger than Daniel, and she had a way of standing in a room that suggested she was always calculating the square footage. She was not unkind in the beginning, she was careful. There is a difference. An unkind person lets you see their edges. A careful person keeps them hidden until the moment they decide you're no longer useful. The first warning sign came 6 months into their marriage, during Thanksgiving. I had driven up to their home in Portland, a lovely craftsman house Daniel had bought before Brittany, thank God. And I noticed that the photo of Harold and me from Daniel's college graduation had been moved from the living room mantel to a closet shelf. When I asked Daniel about it, he said Brittany was redoing the aesthetic. I smiled and helped with the cranberry sauce. The second warning sign came the following Easter. Brittany made a comment at dinner, lightly, with a laugh, the way people say things they mean, about how it must be so hard living alone on a fixed income. I was sipping my iced tea. I said nothing. Fixed income. I was running 4 revenue streams at the time. The third warning sign came when Daniel called me in October and suggested, gently, carefully, the way Brittany had taught him to be gentle and careful, that I consider selling my Boise house and moving in with them. They had a guest room. It would be easier for everyone. I should have heard the word easier and asked, easier for whom? But I was lonely. That is the truth I am not ashamed of. Harold had been gone 17 years and the evenings were long, and Daniel was my son, my boy, the child I had raised alone after Harold's first heart attack left him half present for years. I said yes. I moved to Portland in January. I brought my plants, my laptop, my external hard drives. My entire business lived on those drives. And 2 boxes of Harold's things I couldn't part with. I paid no rent. I offered to, repeatedly. Daniel said it wasn't necessary. Brittany said nothing, which I later understood was her loudest language. The first 3 weeks were pleasant enough. Then the pleasantness wore thin. Brittany began making comments about my schedule. I worked early mornings, 4 to 8 a.m., before the house woke up. She said the keyboard noise carried. I bought a quieter keyboard. She said the light from my laptop bothered her when she passed the hallway. I started working with the door closed. She said she could hear me on calls. I began using earphones and whispering. I was shrinking. I could feel it. And still I told myself, she is adjusting. This is new for everyone. Daniel loves you. Give it time. Then came the evening of March 14th. I had been on a call with a client in London. It ran long, 20 minutes past what I'd planned. When I came out of the guest room, Brittany was standing in the hallway. Her arms were crossed. Daniel was behind her, and I noticed he was not looking at me. "Margaret," Brittany said. She never called me Mom, not once. "We need to talk about boundaries." I said, of course, and I followed them to the kitchen. What happened next took 11 minutes. I counted them later, lying awake, because that is what you do when your mind needs to measure a wound. Brittany spoke about how this arrangement wasn't working, how I was always underfoot, how the guest room was actually meant to be a home office for her growing candle business, how they had been more than generous. And then she said it. The thing from the title of this story, the thing I will never forget as long as I live. "You're a poor woman living off our hospitality. We don't need a penniless old lady taking up space in our home. Pack your things." I looked at my son. Daniel looked at the kitchen floor, and then he walked to the guest room, and I heard him pulling my suitcase out from under the bed. I stood in that kitchen for exactly the amount of time it took me to decide I would not cry in front of Brittany Caldwell. That was the only decision I made in those first 60 seconds. Everything else, the grief, the disbelief, the specific pain of watching my son refuse to meet my eyes, I folded up and put somewhere behind my sternum, the way you press a letter into an envelope when you're not ready to send it yet. Daniel set my suitcase by the front door. Then he went back for my laptop bag. Then the 2 boxes of Harold's things. He stacked them neatly on the porch, which somehow made it worse. The neatness of it, the care he took arranging my whole life in a 4-foot pile on painted wood. It was 41 degrees outside. I know because I checked my phone as I stood there, because my mind was doing what it always does under pressure, collecting data. Brittany had not followed us to the door. She was already back in the kitchen. I could hear her filling the kettle. "Mom?" Daniel said. He was still not looking at me. "I'm sorry. This is just... it's not working." "You said that," I replied. "You can call me when you get settled." I picked up my laptop bag. I lifted the suitcase handle. I looked at my son. This man I had driven to every soccer practice, every orthodontist appointment, who I had held at 2 in the morning when Harold's heart gave out the first time, and Daniel was 16 and terrified. And I said very quietly, "I will." Then I walked to my Honda and I drove. I drove for 20 minutes without knowing where I was going, which is not like me. I am a woman who has had a destination for most of her adult life. But that night, Portland moved past my windows like a city I'd never been to, all wet streets and yellow light. And I just drove until I found myself in the parking lot of a Marriott courtyard near the Lloyd District. I checked in for 3 nights. I paid cash from the emergency envelope I kept in my laptop bag. Harold's habit, passed to me, I went to my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, and I allowed myself exactly 45 minutes to feel everything. I cried for Harold first. I always do in the worst moments, because he would have known what to say and how to say it, and exactly when to put his hand on mine. Then I cried for Daniel, not the man who had stacked my boxes on a 41-degree porch, but the boy I'd raised, who I was now not sure I recognized. Then I cried for myself, briefly and practically, because I have never seen self-pity as a useful long-term activity. At the 46-minute mark, I washed my face, opened my laptop, and started a new document. I titled it, "What is True?" This is something I learned in business and in grief. When everything feels chaotic, establish the facts. So, I wrote them down. What is true? I am 68 years old. I am in good health. I have no mortgage. My business generated $79,400 last month. I have $2.3 million in savings and investments. I have been told I am a burden by a woman who has never asked me a single question about my life. My son did not defend me. I read it back twice. Then I wrote one more line. What is also true? I do not have to accept this as the end of anything. I spent the next 3 days in that hotel room doing two things simultaneously, grieving and planning. I let them run in parallel. In the mornings I worked, client emails, invoices, a new product listing for a Victorian secretary desk I'd sourced in October. In the afternoons, I made calls. I found a furnished apartment in the Irvington neighborhood, 2 miles from Daniel and Brittany's house, available month to month. I signed the lease on day 3. It was a good apartment. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a kitchen window that looked out onto a maple tree. I paid 6 months up front, which made the landlord visibly relieved and completely uninterested in asking questions. I moved in with my suitcase, my laptop, my drives, and Harold's boxes. I bought groceries. I bought a new plant, a pothos, because they survive anything, and I put it in the kitchen window. And then I sat in my new living room on a rented couch, and I let myself think. Not feel, think. Here is what I thought about. Brittany's face when she said, "penniless old lady." The specific satisfaction in it. The way she had said it like she was issuing a verdict she had prepared well in advance. And I thought about Daniel's silence, which was its own kind of verdict. They had decided who I was. They had built a version of me, small, dependent, a charity case in their Craftsman house. And they had evicted that version. The problem, for them, was that the version they had built had nothing to do with who I actually was. And that gave me an idea. A very specific, very deliberate idea. I opened my laptop and I went to Zillow. I typed in Daniel and Brittany's street address, Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, and I looked at what was available in their neighborhood. There was one listing that stopped my scrolling. Directly across the street from their Craftsman home, I could see it in the listing photos, their blue front door visible in the background, was a 3-bedroom bungalow, gray with white trim, a covered porch, a big maple in the front yard, listed at $687,000. Available immediately, vacant, the seller motivated. I looked at that listing for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my financial advisor. "Barbara," I said, "I need to talk about a real estate purchase." "Of course," she said. "Investment property?" "Personal residence," I said, and I gave her the address on Sycamore Lane. Barbara Nguyen had been my financial advisor for 11 years, and she had learned in that time not to ask me why I wanted something, only whether the numbers worked. "Give me 24 hours," she said. I'll pull the comps and look at your liquidity position. I already know my liquidity position, I said. I need you to confirm the purchase won't create any tax complications if I use the investment account. She paused. Margaret, that's a significant withdrawal. I know what it is, Barbara. Another pause. Then, I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called a real estate attorney named Patricia Howe, whom I'd found through the Oregon State Bar's referral directory. I had met Patricia once, briefly, at a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier when I was scouting Portland as a possible base for my business. She was precise and unhurried, which are the two qualities I require most in a lawyer. I explained the situation in broad strokes. I wished to purchase a specific property, I intended to pay cash, and I needed the transaction handled with complete confidentiality regarding the buyer's identity until closing. That's not unusual for cash purchases, Patricia said. We can use a trust or LLC as the purchasing entity. A trust, I said. The Harold Ellis Family Trust. I had established that trust 8 years ago for estate planning purposes. Harold's name on it still gave me a particular kind of comfort, as though he were still co-signing my decisions from wherever he had gone. Patricia said she would begin the paperwork. I asked how quickly we could move to closing if the seller was motivated. Cash, no contingencies, motivated seller? 3 weeks, possibly 2. Make it 2, I said. Over the following days, I moved quietly. I drove past Sycamore Lane twice, not in front of the gray bungalow, but through the parallel alley, to look at the property from different angles. The bones were excellent. The roof looked newer. The backyard was overgrown, but had potential. There was a detached garage that, I noted, could serve as a workspace. The listing agent was a young man named Tyler, who seemed genuinely baffled that a cash buyer had materialized within 48 hours of the listing going live. I let him be baffled. I asked practical questions. Age of the HVAC system, any history of foundation issues, HOA status, no HOA. Good. I did not drive past Daniel and Brittany's blue front door. I did not need to. I had the listing photos, and in one of them, the wide shot of the bungalow's exterior, taken from the street. I could see their porch clearly, the 2 rocking chairs they kept there, the hanging fern Brittany was so proud of. The fern looked healthy. It wouldn't for much longer, I suspected. But that wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. It was during the second week of this process, while Patricia was finalizing the purchase agreement and Barbara had confirmed the capital transfer, that I received the information that changed everything from a matter of dignity into a matter of record. I had a friend, Carol Simmons, 71, a retired school teacher who had lived 3 doors down from Daniel and Brittany for 6 years. Carol and I had met at Daniel's housewarming party before Brittany had fully consolidated her position, and we had stayed in touch. Monthly coffee when I visited Portland, occasional texts. Carol called me on a Thursday evening. Margaret, she said without preamble, I don't know if I should be telling you this. Tell me, I said. Carol had been at a neighborhood book club 2 nights earlier. Brittany had not attended. Brittany never attended, but a woman named Sandra, who lived next door to Daniel and Brittany, had. And Sandra, apparently loosened by 2 glasses of Chardonnay, had mentioned something that she thought was common knowledge. Brittany had been planning Margaret's removal since October. Not since the boundaries conversation in the hallway. Since October. 4 months before it happened. 4 months before I arrived with my plants and my laptop and Harold's boxes. Sandra had heard it directly from Brittany herself during a backyard conversation over the fence in November. Brittany had told Sandra that Daniel's mother's situation would be resolved by spring. She had described the guest room as already spoken for. Her candle business, the home office, the plan she had outlined to Daniel. She said, and Sandra quoted this carefully because she had found it striking at the time, "She'll have no choice. She sold her house. Where is she going to go?" I sat very still on my rented couch. I had sold my Boise house in December, 3 months after Brittany had made that calculation. I had sold it because Daniel had convinced me, gradually, over several conversations, that I wouldn't need it anymore, that Portland was home now, that they wanted me there. Those conversations had begun in September, 1 month before Brittany told Sandra the situation would be resolved by spring. I understood now. The invitation hadn't been an invitation. It had been a procurement. Get the old woman to sell her house, eliminate her exit, then remove her on a timeline of our choosing. I asked Carol if Sandra would be willing to write down what she'd heard and sign it. "I think she would," Carol said quietly. "She felt terrible when she found out what happened to you. She didn't know it had already been carried out. Can you ask her for me?" "Yes," Carol said. "Margaret, are you all right?" I looked at the pothos in my kitchen window. It had put out 2 new leaves since I'd brought it home. "I am better than all right," I said. "I am informed." 2 days later, I had a signed, dated, notarized statement from Sandra Paulson, 47, of Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, attesting to the conversation she had witnessed between Brittany Ellis and herself in November on the subject of Margaret Ellis's planned removal from the family home. Patricia added it to the file she was building, and on a gray Tuesday morning in early April, I signed the closing documents for the Harold Ellis Family Trust's acquisition of 14 Sycamore Lane, Portland, Oregon, the property directly across the street from my son's blue front door. I drove to the closing. I signed everything. I accepted the keys from Tyler, who still looked mildly bewildered. I drove to the property, unlocked the front door, walked through the empty rooms that smelled of old wood and possibility. I stood at the living room window and looked across the street. I could see their porch, the rocking chairs, the hanging fern. I thought, Daniel, when you see my name on that mailbox, I want you to understand something. This isn't revenge. This is a woman who you underestimated, showing you the cost of that error. Then I went to measure the windows for curtains. I didn't rush the move. I had learned in 68 years that the best actions are the ones executed without urgency, because urgency makes you sloppy, and sloppiness gives other people leverage. I hired a small moving company, 2 young men named Josh and Marcus, who worked efficiently and didn't ask personal questions. And over the course of a single Saturday, my life migrated from the Irvington apartment to 14 Sycamore Lane. I had bought several pieces of furniture in the interim weeks: a proper bed, a reading chair, a desk for my work setup, a kitchen table with 4 chairs I would likely only ever use for myself, but wanted anyway, because a table with 4 chairs says something different about a life than a table with one. I had also bought new curtains, linen, cream-colored, for the living room windows that faced the street. I did not open those curtains on moving day. I wasn't ready for that yet. The discovery happened on Sunday morning, 31 hours after the moving truck left. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a car door close in a way that carried significance. Not the casual thump of a neighbor leaving for church, but the sharp, declarative slam of someone who has just seen something that made them forget to be careful. I looked through the kitchen window, which faced the side yard, and saw nothing. Then I heard footsteps on my porch. The knock was loud, the kind that is just barely, not a bang. I took my coffee with me to the door. I was wearing my good navy cardigan, the one with the brass buttons, Because I had dressed properly that morning as I always do. Another of Harold's lessons. How you dress tells you what kind of day you're going to have. I opened the door. Daniel and Brittany stood on my porch. Daniel looked like a man who had just discovered the ground was not where he thought it was. His face was doing three things at once: confusion, something almost like fear, and beneath it, working its way up, anger. Brittany's face was doing only one thing. Brittany's face was doing what it always did: calculating. "Mom," Daniel said. It was the first time I had heard his voice since he carried my boxes to a 41-degree porch. "Daniel," I said. "Brittany." I didn't offer them a smile. I didn't offer them anything. I held my coffee with both hands and waited. "What is this?" Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "What are you doing?" "I live here," I said. "You bought this house?" Daniel said. "The Harold Ellis Family Trust did, yes?" A pause. Brittany's eyes moved from my face to the interior of the house behind me, cataloging, assessing, adding up what she saw and what it meant. I watched her do it. This is insane," she said. Then the control slipped, just slightly, and what came through was not anger, but something closer to panic dressed as anger. "You can't do this. You can't just move across the street from us." "I'm not aware of any ordinance that prevents it," I said. "Are you?" Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, this isn't... You're trying to make a point. I understand, but this is too far. You need to think about what you're doing." "I thought about it quite carefully," I said. "Over several weeks." "We want you to sell it," Brittany said. "We'll help you find something. Somewhere in Portland, somewhere comfortable, but not..." She gestured at the street, at the 12 yards between my porch and her blue front door. "Not here." "No, thank you," I said. Brittany's composure finally left her. It didn't leave gradually. It left all at once, the way a weather system breaks. "You're doing this to punish us," she said, her voice rising. "You're a vindictive old woman, and you're doing this to make our lives miserable, and I will not allow it. Do you hear me? I will not allow it." "Brittany," Daniel said quietly, but not to stop her, to warn her, which told me he could see what I could see, that she had lost the room. "You have no friends here," Brittany continued. "You have no community here. Nobody on this street wants a bitter old woman sitting in her window watching their house. You'll be miserable and alone, and when you finally come to your senses..." "Brittany." This time Daniel's voice had more edge to it. She stopped. She was breathing hard. I looked at my son. I said, "I have a document, signed and notarized, from a neighbor on this street, attesting to a conversation in which your wife stated that my removal from your home was planned 4 months before it occurred. During the same period you were encouraging me to sell my house in Boise. I shared that document with my attorney. It is in a file. I want you to know that it exists." The porch went very quiet. Daniel's face did something then that I hadn't expected. It cracked. Not in rage, in something that looked, briefly, like shame. Brittany was staring at me. The calculation was back in her eyes, but it was running slower now. Something had jammed the mechanism. "You have 2 choices," I said. "You can leave my porch and we can be neighbors, which will require nothing from you except basic civil behavior. Or you can continue this conversation in a direction that I promise you will find much more uncomfortable. What would you like to do?" They left. I closed my door. I went back to the kitchen, poured out the coffee that had gone cold, and stood at the sink for a long moment, with both hands gripping the edge of the counter. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just faced down my son and the woman who had engineered my homelessness, and I had done it cleanly. But the body doesn't always know the difference between winning and being in danger. My hands were trembling slightly. I allowed that. I spent the next 4 days doing almost nothing. I planted the backyard, bulbs, early perennials, some herbs along the fence. I read 3 novels. I watched the maple in my front yard change its light through the day. I did the minimum necessary for my business, and I let my clients' auto-responses handle the rest. I wasn't hiding, I was recharging. There is a crucial difference. On the 5th day after the porch confrontation, a basket appeared on my doorstep. It was a handsome basket. Wicker, lined with gingham, filled with artisanal items, a jar of local honey, 2 candles in amber glass, a packet of specialty tea, a small card in Brittany's handwriting that said, "Neighbors can have a fresh start, too." I looked at the basket for a long time. Then I photographed it, card and all, and sent the image to Patricia Howe with a note. For the file. I brought the basket inside because the honey was good quality and I saw no reason to waste it. But I did not respond to the card. 2 days after the basket, Daniel called. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail because I needed to know what register he was operating in. His voice was careful, apologetic in texture, but not quite apologetic in content. The difference between a person who is sorry and a person who is performing sorrow in hopes of a specific outcome. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot. I want you to know that I hear you. I know things got out of hand. Brittany and I have talked, and we think maybe we all started off on the wrong foot. Can we try to move forward? I love you. Call me back." Started off on the wrong foot, as though he had stepped on my shoe at a party. As though I had not been maneuvered out of my home and my stability with months of deliberate planning. As though the notarized document didn't exist. I did not call back, not that day and not the next. What I did instead was knock on Carol Simmons's door. Carol lived at number 8 Sycamore Lane, 3 houses down from Daniel and 2 houses down from me. She opened the door in a flour-dusted apron and immediately stepped aside to let me in, which is the kind of person Carol is. She doesn't wait to decide if she's glad to see you. She's already glad before you finish knocking. We sat in her kitchen, which smelled of baking and old wood and the particular warmth of a house that has been genuinely lived in. She made tea without asking if I wanted any. She put out a plate of shortbread. I told her everything. Not the financial details. I am still a private woman. But everything about the basket and the voicemail and the signed statement and the house. Carol listened without interrupting, which is also rare and worth noting. When I finished, she set down her teacup and said, "You know what you did? You named yourself on that street. And names matter." "What do you mean?" "I mean Brittany has been the one who defined you on this block, since before you even moved in with them. She told people you were Daniel's elderly mother who needed looking after. She did it kindly, Margaret. She's good at kindness as a tool. But she defined you. And now you've shown up across the street in your own house with brass buttons on your cardigan, and you're defining yourself. And that frightens her." I thought about that. Carol introduced me to 3 other neighbors over the following week. Organically, through walks and front yard conversations, and one spontaneous invitation to a Sunday potluck that 6 households on the block attended. There was Sandra, of course, who greeted me with the particular warmth of someone who is relieved to see you looking well. There was Jim, 64, a retired engineer who lived at the corner and seemed quietly delighted by anyone with strong opinions and a good handshake. There was Maria, 48, who ran a daycare from her home and observed everything on the street with a calm, comprehensive attention that I immediately respected. I did not speak about Daniel and Brittany directly. I didn't need to. I was simply present. I was a neighbor. I went to the potluck. I brought a lemon cake. I listened more than I spoke. and I let the street form its own opinion of me independently of the one Brittany had been preloading. It was at that potluck that Jim said, in the way that people say things that are both casual and deliberate, "Nice to finally meet you properly, Margaret. Daniel's been saying you were, well, you seem like you're doing just fine." "What did Daniel say I was?" I asked pleasantly. Jim glanced toward number 11, Daniel's house, and then back at me. "Struggling," he said. "He mentioned you'd had some financial difficulties." I smiled. I took a small sip of my lemonade. "How interesting," I said. And I said nothing else on the subject because I didn't need to. The house across the street said everything. I could see, from Jim's expression, that he was already revising his received information. Later that evening, I sat on my covered porch as the street quieted down for the night. The maple was doing something beautiful with the last of the light. I could see Daniel and Brittany's living room window, lit from inside, the shapes of them moving occasionally behind frosted glass. I was not watching them with malice. I want that to be clear. I was watching the way you watch weather. Not to control it, but to understand it. The basket had been Brittany's first probe, the voicemail Daniel's. Neither had landed. They would try again. People who have operated through control rarely stop cleanly when the first effort fails. They recalibrate. I was ready to be recalibrated against. In fact, I was counting on it. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the basket. I had been expecting them, not on that particular Saturday, but in that general window. Brittany had a rhythm to her strategies. Probe, withdraw, recalibrate, advance. It was the rhythm of someone who was accustomed to winning through attrition. I had mapped it across the months I'd spent in their house, the small escalations and retreats, the way she would push until you softened, and then push again into the newly softened space. I saw them cross the street from my kitchen window. I had time to set down my coffee, smooth my cardigan, the same navy one, deliberately, and reach the door before they knocked. Daniel was carrying flowers, pale pink dahlias from what I could tell, wrapped in brown paper. Brittany was carrying a paper bag from the French bakery on Morrison Street, the expensive one. They had prepared. "Mom," Daniel said when I opened the door. His smile was the one I recognized from his childhood, the one he deployed when he'd broken something and was hoping hope would do the work of accountability. "Can we come in?" I considered it. I could have said no. Patricia would likely have preferred I said no. But I had learned something important over 68 years of managing people. The most revealing thing a person does is what they do when you give them an opening. So I said yes, and I stepped back from the door. We sat in my living room, which by then had taken on its proper character. The reading chair, the framed photograph of Harold and me from our trip to Oregon coast in 2003, the 2 good lamps that cast the room in warm light. I saw Brittany take in the room as she sat down. I saw the micro-adjustment in her face, the recalibration, as she processed that it was not what she'd expected. It was not the room of a woman who was struggling. "We've been thinking a lot," Daniel began. He was sitting forward on the sofa, flowers in his lap. Brittany was beside him, the bakery bag on her knees, her posture open and soft. She had practiced this posture. I could see its practice in it. About everything. About how things went. "And?" I said. "And we want to start over," Daniel said. We want things to be good between us. We're family." He held out the dahlias. I looked at them. I did not reach for them. "Daniel," I said, "I'd like to believe that. What does starting over look like specifically in your mind?" He glanced at Brittany. The glance was small and quick, but I had 40 years of reading my son's face, and it told me clearly. She wrote the answer. "It looks like everyone moving forward," Brittany said. Her voice was warm. It was remarkable. The warmth. Not manufactured, exactly, but applied. The way you apply a coat of paint to a surface. Not holding on to the past. Not. Her eyes moved briefly around the room, settling on the window that faced their house. Not making choices designed to create discomfort for other people. I chose a home I loved, I said. In a neighborhood I had already come to know. What's discomforting about that? Brittany's warmth adjusted slightly. Margaret, I think we both know that living directly across the street from your estranged son and his wife is not a neutral choice. I'm not estranged from my son, I said. He's welcome to call me. He left a voicemail 3 weeks ago. I heard it. You didn't call back, Daniel said. No, I agreed. I didn't. A pause. Daniel set the dahlias on the coffee table, gently, in what I recognized as a small act of grief. Brittany pressed forward. What would it take, she said, for you to consider a different arrangement? Something more, comfortable, for everyone. What you're asking me, I said, is to leave. We're asking you to think about what's best long term, she said. At your age, being isolated from your family, in a house that's more than you need. At your age, there it was, the velvet scalpel. I'm not isolated, I said. I had dinner with Carol Simmons on Thursday. Jim from the corner helped me identify my maple last weekend. Maria's children wave at me every morning when she drops them at the bus stop. I'm less isolated here than I was in your guest room. Brittany's warmth cooled by several degrees. Margaret. She leaned forward very slightly. This situation isn't good for Daniel. For his stress, for his work, for... There are health implications to sustained family conflict. For everyone, including you. I looked at her. I let the silence hold for a full 5 seconds, which is a long time when you're sitting in someone's living room. Are you suggesting that my choice of residence is a health risk? I said. To whom? I'm suggesting, Brittany said, each word careful now, that living this way, watching each other across a street, it's not sustainable. And when things aren't sustainable, eventually, they collapse in ways that aren't good for anyone. Daniel had stopped speaking. He was looking at his hands. I have a different perspective, I said. I think things are quite sustainable. I have a home I own, a business that runs well, neighbors I've grown fond of, and a perfectly clear view of the street, which I find I enjoy. Brittany stood up. The warmth was entirely gone now. You're being willfully obstructive, she said, and childish. I'm being a homeowner, I said, which I have been for 37 years. We'll figure something out, she said. It was a threat in the structure of a sentence. Daniel stood, retrieved the dahlias. It was an automatic gesture, habitual, and it told me more than anything else that morning had told me. He had not expected to leave them here. He had expected a different outcome. At the door he turned. Mom, he said, please. I looked at my son, my boy, who I loved in the way you love something that has caused you your deepest pain and your deepest joy in equal proportion, inseparably. And I said, I'll be here, Daniel. I'm not going anywhere. They walked back across the street. I closed my door and stood in my hallway and acknowledged the fear. It was real. Brittany's last sentence had been designed to generate it, and it had worked in the way that a key works in a lock. It found the right mechanism and turned it. But here is what I also knew, standing in my hallway. Fear, when you don't run from it, doesn't empty you. It fills you. It fills you with the particular clarity of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I wrote a detailed account of the morning's conversation, time, duration, specific statements, and emailed it to Patricia. Then I worked for 4 hours straight, and I was very sharp that afternoon. The Block Association meeting had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Jim organized them quarterly, rotating through neighbors' houses. This one was scheduled for the last Saturday of May at Maria's, which could accommodate 12 people comfortably in her large kitchen dining room. 7 households were attending. I had marked the date in my calendar the day Carol told me about it. I had not planned a scene. I want to be clear about that. What I had planned was to be present, to be myself, and to be prepared if a scene arrived on its own, which I had reason to believe it might. Daniel and Brittany attended. They arrived slightly early, which told me they wanted to establish themselves in the room before I got there. I arrived at the stated time with a lemon pound cake on a plate with a card that said, Margaret, number 14, which several people remarked was a lovely touch. I took a chair at the end of the table near Jim and Sandra. For the first 40 minutes, the meeting was about ordinary things. The pothole on the north end, the question of whether the old Henderson's oak needed a city permit before trimming, a proposal to organize a summer block party. I listened, contributed once on the question of the oak tree, and watched the room. Brittany was performing well. She was engaged, she laughed at the right moments, she touched Daniel's arm in ways that communicated partnership. She was, as Carol had said, good with the tools. But she had not accounted for Sandra. Sandra had not intended to say anything. She told me this afterward, carefully, over coffee. She had truly not intended to. But the combination of 2 glasses of the white wine Maria had put out, and the particular moment that arrived, the moment when Brittany said, in response to a question about the summer block party, it would be so nice for the whole neighborhood to feel like a real community, not just strangers living near each other, was more than Sandra could comfortably hold inside. I think community starts with honesty, Sandra said. Her voice was conversational, not pointed. She was looking at her wine glass, about who people are and what they've actually done. The table shifted slightly. These things happen in rooms, small atmospheric changes like a barometric drop. Brittany looked at Sandra. Absolutely, she said smoothly. I've been thinking about that, Sandra continued, since Margaret moved in across the street. It's an interesting thing. Someone told me Margaret was a woman in financial difficulty who needed looking after. And then she bought a house on our street for cash. A quiet moment. Jim said, Cash purchase? I said pleasantly. The Harold Ellis Family Trust, yes. That's significant, Jim said, looking at me with the expression of a man thoroughly revising a database entry. Someone told you Margaret was struggling financially, Maria asked Sandra, not with aggression, with the particular directness of a woman who runs a daycare and has 0 patience for indirection. Sandra glanced toward Daniel, not toward Brittany, toward Daniel. It was a small thing, but rooms notice small things. Daniel was looking at the table. I may have repeated something I shouldn't have, he said quietly. Daniel, Brittany said. Her voice was controlled, just barely. It wasn't accurate, he said. He said it to the table, not to me. The table was quiet in the way tables go quiet, when everyone present has understood something and is waiting to see if anyone will say it. I said it. I built a business after my husband died, I said. I have been supporting myself entirely for 17 years. I mention this not for any point of pride, but because I think it's important for the people on this street to know who their neighbor actually is. I paused. There was a period when I was staying with Daniel and Brittany. It ended abruptly, in March, when I was told to leave. I found a place to stay. I took some time, and I bought this house. That's the whole story. A pause. Maria was looking at Daniel. Jim was looking at his wine glass, diplomatically. Brittany said, That is a very selective version of events. Then tell the less selective version, I said. Not with heat. With perfect evenness. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. What came out was, "You have no right to discuss our family's private." "You discussed my finances on this street," I said. "You described me as a woman in difficulty, which influenced how my neighbors saw me before I had the chance to introduce myself. I'm simply introducing myself now." "You planned this," Brittany said. Her voice rose. "You came here tonight to humiliate us." "I came here tonight because Jim organized a neighborhood meeting, and I live on this street," I said. "Brittany," Daniel said, low. "She's doing this on purpose, Daniel. She has been doing this on purpose since she moved in here. This is exactly what—" Her voice was climbing, and I watched the room watching her climb. And I watched the moment when Brittany understood. I could see it arrive behind her eyes, that she had lost the room, not to me, to herself. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Jim said gently, "Maybe we should take a short break." Brittany stood up. She walked out of Maria's house without looking at anyone. Daniel followed her, and at the door he paused and looked back at me. A long, complicated look that I will spend more time understanding in the years ahead than I will spend on almost anything else. Then he went after her. The table sat in silence for a moment. Then Sandra topped up my wine glass. Maria put the plate of cookies in front of me. Jim said, "So, the pothole." And the meeting continued. The Block Association meeting had occurred on a Saturday. By Tuesday, it had become, in the quiet way of neighborhoods, a piece of shared knowledge, discussed over back fences and in parked cars and during long front porch conversations. Patricia called on Wednesday. "I want to prepare you for something," she said. "If Daniel and Brittany decide the notarized statement represents a legal threat, they may try to file something. Harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. A weak case, but weak cases still take time." "Let them," I said. "You're sure?" "Patricia, I have documentation of a deliberate scheme to eliminate my housing security. I have a notarized witness statement. I have the timeline of my selling my Boise house running parallel to the timeline of their plan. If they want to put any of this in front of a judge, they're welcome to." They did not file anything. A courthouse is a room where documents become evidence, and Brittany understood that better than Daniel did. Daniel came to my door on Friday evening, alone. He looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. He was not carrying flowers. I made 2 cups of tea. I put one in front of him. I sat across from him. "She didn't know you'd bought the house," he said finally. "She told me it wasn't possible. She said you didn't have that kind of money." "I know she thought that," I said. "She told me you were struggling, that the Boise house sale was, that you were in debt." He stopped. I believed her. "How long did you know about the plan?" I asked. "The October timeline." He looked at the table. "I knew she wanted the room back. I knew it was coming. I didn't know about October." "But you knew it was coming," I said. "Yes." "And you let it come." "Yes." That was the word I had needed, not an excuse, not a context. Just, yes. "Daniel," I said, "I love you in a way that isn't negotiable. You are my son, and that is permanent. But I will not pretend that what was done to me was an accident. It was a plan. Brittany built it, and you consented to it." "I know," he said. "What happens next between us depends entirely on whether you can be honest about that, with me and with yourself. Not on Brittany's timeline, honestly." He was quiet a long time. Then, "She's been different lately, since the meeting." "That's between you and her," I said. "That's not my chapter." He nodded, thanked me for the tea with the specific politeness of someone reaching for a behavior long out of reach, and walked back across the street. What followed arrived in pieces through Carol and Sandra. Brittany began separating their finances in June. A family attorney in the Pearl District, not a couples counselor. The candle business she had cited as the reason my room was needed had generated approximately $1,200 in the prior year. Daniel called me in August and asked if we could have dinner. We went to a small Italian place on Alberta Street and talked for 3 hours. It was not comfortable. It was honest, which is a different and more durable thing. He paid the check. I let him. I did not consider it a victory in the way that word is usually meant. Winning against your own son is not something a mother celebrates, but there is another kind of winning, where you refuse to be made small, where you hold the record of what is true, even when people around you insist on a more convenient version. That kind, I claimed, completely, without apology and without compromise. A year is enough time for a street to know you. By the following May, 14 Sycamore Lane had become a house. People noticed. Not grandly, but in the way of a place that is genuinely occupied and tended. The front garden was producing tulips in April, then lavender along the walk, then the climbing rose from Jim's cutting that had taken magnificently to the trellis beside the porch. I had put a bench under the maple, and on good mornings I took my first coffee out there before sitting down to work. My business had grown. The disruption of the previous year had, in some oblique way, sharpened my focus. I expanded into teaching small estate dealers how to build their own online systems, which pushed my monthly income well past its previous ceiling. I hired a part-time assistant named Priya, exceptionally organized, working remotely from Seattle. Carol and I had dinner every Thursday. Sandra had become a genuine friend. Dry humor, excellent sourdough, real patience. Jim coordinated the block's seasonal plantings and pulled me in as his co-conspirator, which suited me deeply. Maria's children still waved at me every morning from the bus stop. These were not small things. The morning coffee, the Thursday dinners, the children at the bus stop. These are the actual texture of a life. I had rebuilt what I'd sold in Boise and built something better. A home that was chosen. A community that knew me as myself. As for the house across the street, Daniel and Brittany separated in August. The hanging fern browned, and nobody replaced it. Brittany moved to the Pearl District. The candle business did not follow her. Daniel stayed in the Craftsman house, and he and I had dinner every few weeks through fall and winter. The relationship of two people who had hurt each other and decided honesty was worth more than pretending otherwise. He started seeing a therapist and told me so directly. On his birthday, I made the German chocolate cake Harold had always made. He ate 2 slices and looked, for the first time in a long time, like my boy. There were evenings when I sat under the maple in the last of the light and felt something I can only describe as settled. Not triumphant. Settled. I was 69 years old, a house owned outright, a business running beautifully, a street full of people who knew my name, and a pothos in the kitchen window with 17 new leaves. Harold, I thought sometimes, look at what your careful woman built. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Share this story, subscribe, and thank you for listening, dear friends. My son called, "Mom, I'm getting married tomorrow. I sold your house for $800,000. I need the money more than you and my wife." Bye. I just laughed. He didn't know that the house was actually, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway, and I have lived in the same white-framed house on Birchwood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina, for 41 years. I raised my children there. I buried my husband there. Not literally, of course, but the grief of losing Harold settled into those walls the way morning light settles into old curtains, slow, permanent, and somehow still beautiful. The house was mine. Every creak of the porch, every stubborn drawer in the kitchen, every rose bush I'd planted along the fence with my own 67-year-old hands. Mine. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because what happened only makes sense if you understand what that house meant to me. I had 2 children. My daughter Patricia lived in Denver and called every Sunday without fail. She was steady, sensible, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and kept her promises. Then there was my son, Marcus. Marcus was the one I'd worried about since he was 17 and convinced the rules of the world simply didn't apply to him. He was charming in the way that certain dangerous things are charming. The way a summer storm looks beautiful right before it destroys your garden. I loved him. Of course I loved him. But loving Marcus always required a certain vigilance. He'd drifted in and out of my life over the years, appearing when he needed money or a place to stay, disappearing when things were going well for him. After Harold died 5 years ago, Marcus came around more frequently. At first I thought it was grief bringing him home. I told myself he was growing up finally, at 42. But looking back now, I can see the signs I chose not to read. It started small. He asked casually, over dinner one Thanksgiving, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing. I was 70 years old and in perfectly good health. I told him so. He smiled and changed the subject. Then, the following spring, he brought a woman to Sunday dinner. Her name was Renee. She was 34, polished in the way of someone who has practiced being polished, with a smile that arrived slightly before her eyes did. She complimented my kitchen and asked with great sweetness how many square feet the house was. I told her I didn't remember exactly. She nodded as if I'd confirmed something. The questions continued over the following months. Marcus asked if I'd updated my will. He asked whether I'd spoken to a financial advisor. He asked once while standing in the backyard looking at the property line whether the lot extended all the way to the oak tree. He knew it did. He'd climbed that oak tree as a boy. He was mapping something, I realized later. He was calculating. I told myself I was being paranoid. This is what we do with the people we love. We give them the benefit of every possible doubt, long past the point where doubt is reasonable. I kept cooking Sunday dinners. I kept answering his calls. I told myself Marcus was simply curious, simply planning, simply being the attentive son he had never quite managed to be before. And then came the Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and a half-finished crossword puzzle when my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice was bright. Too bright. The way voices get when a person has rehearsed what they're about to say. "Mom," he said, "I've got some big news. Renee and I are getting married. Tomorrow, actually. Small ceremony, just us." I said congratulations and meant it, despite everything. Then came the pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it. "There's something else," he said. "I needed capital to get our life started, and I found a buyer for the house. I signed the papers last week, got $800,000 for it. The closing is in 30 days. You'll need to start thinking about where you want to go next." I sat very still. The crossword puzzle blurred in front of me. "Marcus," I said slowly, "what do you mean you signed papers?" "It's done, Mom. The real estate attorney handled everything. I have power of attorney. You signed it 2 years ago when you had that knee surgery and needed someone to manage things temporarily. I used it. The money's going into mine and Renee's joint account. I've already got plans for it. You'll be fine. You can rent something smaller." He said a few more things. I don't remember all of them. What I remember is that I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat there, in the kitchen of my house, with my coffee growing cold, and I laughed. A short, quiet laugh. The kind that comes not from amusement, but from the sudden, crystalline clarity of finally understanding something you should have understood long ago. Because Marcus, for all his scheming, did not know one very important thing about that house, and that one thing was going to change everything. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. The October light came through the window the way it always did at that hour, golden, unhurried, falling across the linoleum floor in the same pattern it had fallen for 4 decades. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went silent. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, and yet I felt as though I had stepped through some invisible door into a different world entirely. Let me tell you what fear feels like at 70 years old when you have just been told your home has been sold out from under you. It isn't the sharp electric fear of youth. It's slower. It settles into your chest like cold water, and for a moment you cannot breathe, cannot think, can only sit with the weight of it pressing down. I thought of the rose bushes. I thought of the bedroom where Harold and I had slept for 36 years, the particular way the mattress had conformed to the shape of us over time. I thought of the photographs on the hallway wall, Patricia's gap-toothed kindergarten smile, Marcus in his Little League uniform, Harold and me on our wedding day, young and laughing and entirely ignorant of all the years still ahead of us. And then I thought, no, not a dramatic no, not a no shouted at the ceiling, just a quiet, interior no. The kind that comes from somewhere very deep and very certain. The kind that doesn't waver. I got up, washed my coffee cup, and sat back down with a legal pad and a pen. The first thing I needed to understand was the legal reality. Yes, I had signed a power of attorney 2 years ago, during the week after my knee replacement surgery, when I'd been on pain medication and genuinely unable to manage my own affairs for a short period. My attorney at the time, a kind older man named Robert Finch, had drawn it up as a limited, temporary document. The key word was limited. I remembered that clearly because Robert had explained it to me carefully. The document authorized Marcus to handle specific medical and financial decisions during my incapacitation, paying bills, communicating with my insurance company, making medical decisions if I was unconscious. It was not, and I was fairly certain of this, a general durable power of attorney that would allow him to sell real property. This was the thing Marcus didn't know. I remembered exactly what I had signed. I also knew something else he didn't know, something about the house itself. But I wasn't ready to think about that yet. First, I needed to be sure of my legal ground. I picked up the phone and called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, and I told her everything, calmly and in order, the way Harold had always said I told stories. Like a woman who has already decided how it ends. Patricia was quiet through most of it. When I finished, she said, "Mom, that is fraud." Not hysterically, just clearly, like her mother's daughter. "I believe it may be," I said, "but I need to be certain before I do anything." "You need an attorney, not Robert Finch, and he's retired. You need someone who does real estate litigation." She was right. I wrote down, find attorney, real estate, elder law. The next morning, I did not call Marcus back. I had nothing to say to him yet, and more importantly, I did not want him to know I was moving. One of the few advantages I had in this situation was that Marcus believed I was shocked into paralysis. He expected tears, pleas, perhaps a resigned phone call asking where I should start looking for apartments. He did not expect his 70-year-old mother to be sitting at her kitchen table with a legal pad, building a case. I called 3 attorneys that morning, found through the North Carolina State Bar's referral service. The second one I spoke with was a woman named Sandra Okafor, a real estate and elder law attorney based in Asheville. Her assistant fit me in for a consultation the following afternoon. I wrote her name down and underlined it twice. Then I went to my filing cabinet, the old green metal one in the spare bedroom that Marcus had always made fun of, calling it relics from the paper age, and I began to pull documents. The original deed to the house, Harold's death certificate, the power of attorney I'd signed 2 years ago, my will, the title insurance documents from when Harold and I had purchased the property in 1983. And at the very bottom of the third drawer, in a manila envelope labeled in Harold's handwriting, "Important, Dorothy, keep safe," I found the document that made me sit down slowly on the edge of the spare bed and close my eyes for a moment. It was a deed restriction Harold had quietly added to the property title in 1991, the year Marcus had gotten into serious trouble at 18, and Harold had said to me, very quietly, over the kitchen table one night, "I don't want the boy to ever be able to touch this house, Dorothy. No matter what." I had forgotten about it. 30 years is a long time, and grief does things to memory. But Harold, careful, methodical Harold, had not forgotten. He had added a deed restriction specifying that the property could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered without the written, notarized consent of Dorothy May Calloway, regardless of any power of attorney or other legal instrument. Marcus had sold a house he could not legally sell. I put the document back in the envelope, held it in both hands for a moment, and whispered, "Thank you, Harold." Then I picked up my pen and started writing the plan. Sandra Okafor's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Lexington Avenue, above a coffee shop that smelled of dark roast and cinnamon. I arrived 10 minutes early, sat in the waiting area with my manila envelope on my lap, and watched the afternoon traffic move slowly below the window. I had dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but because dressing carefully was something I did when I needed to feel like myself. Gray slacks, a blue cardigan, Harold's watch on my wrist, which I wore on days when I needed steadiness. Sandra Okafor was perhaps 50, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of professional calm that comes from having sat across from a great many people in crisis. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. I did not editorialize or embellish. I laid the documents on her desk in order: the deed, the power of attorney, the deed restriction, the title documents. She read them carefully, with no expression I could interpret, and then she set them down and looked at me. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "the deed restriction your late husband filed is recorded with the county. It's part of the public title record. Any competent real estate attorney conducting a title search before a sale would have found it." She paused. "Which means either the buyer's attorney didn't conduct a proper title search, which is negligence on their part, or someone concealed its existence." Another pause. "Or the sale hasn't actually closed yet, and the title company simply hasn't flagged it." "Marcus said closing was in 30 days, I said. "Then there is time." She picked up her pen. "Here is what we're going to do." The first step, she explained, was a title search, pulling the current public record to understand exactly what Marcus had filed and with whom. The second step was a letter to the escrow company holding the transaction, formally notifying them of the deed restriction and placing the sale in dispute. The third step, if necessary, was a filing with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds to formally contest the transfer. "What about the power of attorney?" I asked. Sandra looked at the document again. "This is a limited POA, medical and financial management during incapacitation. It explicitly does not include real property transactions. See this language here." She pointed. "Whoever advised your son that this authorized a property sale either misread the document or misled him. Either way, the sale, as structured, is void on 2 independent grounds: the restricted deed and the scope of the POA." I nodded slowly. "And if Marcus pushes back, then we pursue it in court?" She said it the way you might say, "Then we order dessert." evenly. But I don't think it will get that far once we put the escrow company on notice. They will not proceed with a contested title. The buyer will walk, or the sale will be unwound. I signed a retainer agreement that afternoon. That evening, I received a text from Marcus. Mom, hope you're starting to look at places. Buyer wants possession in 28 days. Reading it, I felt a strange, cool sensation. Not quite anger, not quite satisfaction, but something between the two. He still thought he had won. He was still playing the game as if I were the piece he was moving, not the player at the other side of the board. I did not respond. 2 days later, Sandra called me with the results of the title search. It's there, she said. Clear as day. The deed restriction is recorded and valid. And here's what's interesting. There's a notation in the escrow file indicating that Marcus's real estate agent was asked about encumbrances on the property and stated there were none. She let that sit for a moment. That's a false statement to an escrow company in the course of a real estate transaction. In North Carolina, that's potentially wire fraud. I sat down in my kitchen chair. So he lied. Someone did. Her voice was careful. I've sent the formal dispute notice to the escrow company. I've also copied the buyer's attorney. The transaction is now legally clouded. It will not close. I held the phone for a moment after she finished speaking. Outside, the rose bushes I'd planted 10 years ago were still holding their last October blooms. Small, stubborn, the deep red ones Harold had always loved. The house was quiet around me. This was the moment I understood. There was no going back now. Marcus would find out about the legal challenge within days, perhaps hours. He would know I had gone to an attorney. He would know I was fighting. And Marcus, when cornered, had never in his life responded with grace. I was not afraid of what was coming, but I was clear-eyed about it. I called Patricia that night and told her what Sandra had found. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, Mom, he actually thought he could do this. Yes, I said. What does he think you are? I considered that question for a moment. Really considered it, the way you consider questions that have more than one honest answer. Then I said, he thinks I'm an old woman who loves him too much to fight back. Patricia said nothing for a second. Then, he doesn't know you very well? No, I agreed, he doesn't. The call from Marcus came 3 days later, on a Friday morning, while I was deadheading the last of the rose bushes along the front fence. I heard the phone ring inside, recognized his number on the screen when I came in, and answered with the same steady voice I would use to answer any call. What did you do? His voice was not bright this time. The rehearsed warmth was entirely gone. Good morning, Marcus, I said. I got a call from the escrow company. They said the sale is in dispute. They're saying there's a restriction on the deed. My attorney says it could invalidate the whole transaction. His voice was controlled, but I could hear something moving underneath it, like water under thin ice. What is this, Mom? That's a deed restriction your father filed in 1991, I said. It requires my written, notarized consent to transfer the property. I didn't give that consent. The sale cannot proceed. Silence. You went behind my back, he said finally. I hired an attorney, I said. That's not behind your back. That's in front of it. The thin ice cracked. His voice shifted. Not to grief, not to remorse, but to a cold, calculated hardness that I recognized from his teenage years, from every moment in his life when he had been caught doing something he knew was wrong and decided to meet it with aggression rather than accountability. You don't understand what you're doing, he said. The buyer has already committed resources to this. I have an agreement. If you blow this up, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences, Marcus? A pause. Renee's brother is an attorney. a litigator. If you think you can use some dusty old document to embarrass me and walk away clean, you're wrong. We'll challenge that restriction. We'll argue Dad wasn't in his right mind when he filed it. We'll argue undue influence. We'll argue Harold was in perfect health in 1991, I said. The filing is clean and properly recorded. Your attorney will tell you the same thing mine told me. I'm warning you, Mom. The word Mom had a strange quality in his mouth now. Not affectionate, not even neutral, but vaguely contemptuous. Don't do this. I stood in my kitchen, Harold's watch on my wrist, the manila envelope in its drawer, and I said, I already have. He hung up. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment, breathing. My hands were steady. I want to be honest with you. There was a part of me that ached. Not for the Marcus who had just threatened me on the phone, but for the boy who had once climbed the oak tree in the backyard and called down to me that he could see all the way to the mountains. That boy and this man were not the same person, and I had been slow to accept that. But I accepted it now. The next move came not from Marcus but from Renee. She arrived at my door the following afternoon, unannounced, which was itself a kind of message. She was dressed beautifully, as always, and she brought flowers. Yellow tulips, which struck me as a calculated choice, cheerful and unthreatening. She asked if she could come in. I let her because I wanted to hear what she had to say. She sat at my kitchen table and told me, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound both reasonable and sad, that Marcus was under a lot of pressure, that they had made financial commitments based on the expected proceeds, that she hoped we could find a way to resolve this as a family. She said the words "as a family" twice. She touched my hand once, briefly, and then, when I said nothing except to ask her to please remove her hand, something shifted in her face. The calibrated sadness dropped away. What replaced it was something flatter and harder. Dorothy, she said, and the use of my first name was another small act of aggression. We will go to court. We will contest the restriction. We will make the case that Harold was not competent, and even if we lose, we will drag this out for 2 years. Do you really want to spend the last years of your life in litigation? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stood up, picked up the tulips from where she'd set them on the counter, walked to the front door, and opened it. Renee, I said, I'm going to ask you to leave my house. Her jaw tightened. She stood. She walked to the door with the particular stiff dignity of someone who expected a different outcome. On the porch, she turned back and looked at me with something I can only describe as a cold assessment, as though she was recalculating. This isn't over, she said. I know, I said, and closed the door. Sandra filed the formal deed restriction defense with the county that afternoon. The buyer, having been informed by their own attorney that the title was fatally clouded, formally withdrew from the transaction 3 days later. The sale was dead. Marcus sent me a text that evening that I will not reproduce here because some words, once read, take a long time to forget. Patricia called that night, and I told her everything. She was on a flight from Denver the next morning. I spent the following 4 days doing very little. I sat on my porch in the afternoons. I worked in the garden. I read a novel I'd been meaning to read for a year. I let Patricia cook for me and argue with Marcus on the phone so I didn't have to. I slept 8 hours each night, which I had not managed in weeks. The threat was not gone. I knew that. But I had established my ground, and the ground was solid, and sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply rest in the knowledge of that. On the fifth day, when Patricia had gone back to Denver with reluctance and a long list of emergency contacts she'd saved in my phone, Marcus tried a different approach. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, not in the aggressive voice of the previous week, but in the old voice, the one I recognized from his childhood, warm and slightly plaintive, the voice he used when he wanted something and had decided charm was the better instrument. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been under enormous stress. He said Renee had pushed him further than he was comfortable going, and that if there was any way we could sit down and talk about this like adults, he would really appreciate that. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Marcus, I love you. I will always love you. And I need you to understand that those two things, my love for you and my defense of this house, are not in conflict. I am not punishing you. I am protecting something that belongs to me, that your father worked for, that I have lived in for 41 years. No amount of conversation is going to change that." A pause. "So you won't even talk to me?" "I will always talk to you," I said. "But if talking means considering handing over my home, then no, that conversation isn't possible." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, Mom." Not angry. Something harder than anger. A withdrawal. A door closing. "Okay." He hung up, and I sat with the silence, and I noticed that my hands were entirely still in my lap. Over the following days, I became aware that Marcus and Renee had not entirely disappeared. My neighbor Connie, who lived 2 doors down and had known me since Patricia was in grade school, mentioned that she'd seen a car parked across the street for several hours one afternoon. A silver sedan she didn't recognize. She mentioned it casually, as neighbors do, but we both understood what it meant. They were watching, waiting to see if I would crack, if the pressure of the past 2 weeks would ultimately wear me down into compliance. It would not. But I will admit that knowing I was being observed was unsettling in a particular way. Not because I had anything to hide, but because it was a reminder that this was not over, that Marcus's retreat was strategic rather than genuine. I decided that week that I needed to stop carrying this alone. I had a small circle of friends in Asheville, women I'd known for years, women who had weathered their own varieties of difficulty and loss. There was Connie, of course. There was my friend Margot, who had raised 3 children alone after her husband left, and who had consequently developed a pragmatic toughness I had always admired. There was Judith, a retired social worker who knew more about family dysfunction and legal protections for older adults than anyone I'd ever met. I invited them to dinner on a Thursday night. I cooked the pot roast Harold's mother had taught me, the one that required 3 hours and wasn't worth cutting short. I set the table properly, the good china, the cloth napkins, the candles. When they arrived and we had eaten, and the wine was open, and the evening had settled into the easy warmth that long friendships produce, I told them everything. They did not interrupt. They did not offer false comfort. When I finished, Margot put down her glass and said, "Dot, I always thought that boy was headed somewhere difficult." She said it without cruelty, simply as a statement of fact. Judith leaned forward. "Do you know about the Adult Protective Services reporting mechanism? Not that you need it now, but if Marcus tries to reclassify this as a competency matter, which Renee seemed to hint at, there are preemptive things you can document." Connie said, "I will personally call the police if I see that silver car again." I laughed. Really laughed. The first time in weeks that laughter came from something that felt like joy rather than irony. These women knew me. They had watched me grieve Harold. They had brought me food in the months after the funeral when I sometimes forgot to cook. They understood that what was at stake was not just a property value, but a life, a history, a self. After they left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, less alone. The case was in Sandra's capable hands. Patricia called every evening. And now Connie, Margot, and Judith knew, which meant that whatever Marcus planned next, he would not be doing it in the shadows. I dried my hands on the dish towel and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the oak tree standing dark against the evening sky. "I've got people, Harold," I said quietly. "Don't worry. They came on a Sunday. I was returning from church. Something I had done every Sunday of my adult life, a habit so deep it had long since passed beyond habit into something closer to identity, when I saw Marcus's car in my driveway. He was standing by it, and Renee was beside him, and they were both dressed in a way that I recognized as deliberate. Marcus in the blue sweater I'd given him 3 Christmases ago, Renee in something modest and unremarkable. We come in peace. That was the message the clothing was meant to send. I pulled into the garage, sat in the car for a moment, and said a short prayer. Not for patience exactly, more for clarity. When I came out, Marcus said, "Mom, we'd really like to talk, if that's all right." I looked at them both for a moment. Then I said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had taken Marcus's phone call, where I had written my plans, where I had eaten dinner with my friends the previous week. The table had been the site of so many things in this house. Renee kept her hands folded in her lap and maintained a soft, regretful expression that I suspected had required some practice. I set 3 mugs on the table and let the silence sit for a moment before anyone spoke. There was something instructive about that silence. It revealed who was uncomfortable with it and who wasn't. Renee shifted slightly. Marcus cleared his throat. I poured the coffee. Marcus began. He said that he had spoken to his attorney and understood now that the deed restriction was probably valid. He said he was not planning to contest it, that the litigation path had been Renee's idea more than his, which I noticed Renee did not contradict. He said that he was deeply sorry for the distress he had caused me, that he loved me, and that he hoped we could put this behind us. I said nothing. I sipped my coffee. Then Renee spoke. She said softly that she hoped I understood they had only been trying to secure their future, that they wanted children, that the cost of living was impossible for young people today. She said she felt terrible about how things had escalated. And then, sliding it in as smooth as glass under a door, she said, "We wondered if maybe there was a way we could work something out together. The house is large, and you're here alone. And if you were ever to consider a co-ownership arrangement, you'd stay, of course. We'd all live here, and Marcus and I could help with the upkeep." I set down my coffee cup. "No," I said. Renee continued as though I hadn't spoken. "Just think about it. You'd have company, you'd have help with the house, and we'd all—" "Renee," I said. I said no. This house is not available for co-ownership. It is not available for sale. It is not available for any arrangement that places you or Marcus on the title. This conversation has an endpoint, and we've reached it." The soft expression left Renee's face as completely as a light going out. What replaced it was something sharp and unguarded, real, finally, and directed at me with the specificity of someone who has decided to stop pretending. "Do you understand," she said, her voice very controlled, "that Marcus is your son, that you're choosing a house over your own child?" "I'm choosing myself," I said. Marcus said in a low voice, "Mom, you're being cruel." And there it was. The final instrument in the toolkit, after charm had failed and intimidation had failed, and manufactured reconciliation had failed. Cruelty. The suggestion that a woman defending her own home, her own life, her own 41 years of history, was the one doing harm. I had expected it, somewhere in the back of my mind, because I had watched Marcus operate this way his entire life. When all else failed, make the other person feel guilty for having boundaries at all. It was an old trick, and I was no longer young enough to fall for it. I stood up. "I think you should go," I said. "Both of you." They left. Marcus's last look at me from the door was not angry. It was something colder than anger, the look of someone filing something away for later use. Renee did not look back at all. I heard their car back out of the driveway, and then the street was quiet again, and the house settled around me the way it always did. Steadily, without drama, like an old friend who simply stays. I locked the door. I stood in my hallway with my back against the wood for a moment, and I will not pretend that I felt nothing. I felt something, a cold, slipping sensation in my chest. Not quite fear, but adjacent to it. The fear of what Marcus's cold look might mean. The fear of how far he might take this. The fear that I was still, after all of this, not entirely safe. I thought about that silver sedan Connie had mentioned, parked across the street for hours. I thought about Desmond, the litigator brother-in-law, and what resources he might still be willing to bring to bear. I thought about the particular vulnerability of being 70 years old and alone in a house that someone else wanted. But here is what I have learned about fear. It is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a signal, a reminder that something matters enough to protect. I felt the fear, and I felt, underneath it, the same steady no that had come to me in the first moments after his phone call. The house was mine. Harold's restriction was recorded. Sandra was one call away. Patricia knew everything. I was afraid, and I was not backing down. In the end, it was not my plan that brought Marcus and Renee to their decisive unraveling. It was their own. Sandra had been quietly thorough in the 2 months since the sale had been blocked. Beyond the deed restriction defense, she had been building a secondary file, gathering documentation around the false statement to the escrow company, the misuse of the limited power of attorney, and a third element I hadn't anticipated. It appeared that Renee's brother, the litigator she had mentioned during her first visit to my home, had drafted several letters to Sandra on Marcus and Renee's behalf, containing statements about the power of attorney's scope that were demonstrably incorrect. Whether this was incompetence or deliberate misrepresentation was, Sandra said, something that the North Carolina State Bar might have an interest in. Sandra had not moved forward on any of this without my instruction. She simply assembled it, organized it, and one afternoon in late November presented it to me across her desk in a neat folder. "You have options," she said. "You can let the blocked sale stand as your victory and walk away, or you can use this to ensure they never try this again." I looked at the folder for a long moment. What does "ensure they never try again" look like? She told me, and I said yes. The mediation session was Sandra's idea. A formal, structured meeting with Marcus, Renee, and Renee's brother, Desmond, who was, in fact, an attorney, though his specialty was personal injury rather than real estate, which explained several things. It was framed in the letter Sandra sent as an opportunity to resolve outstanding disputes related to the Birchwood Lane property and associated legal matters before any further action was taken. Marcus, Desmond's advice notwithstanding, agreed to attend. I suspected this was because he still believed there was something to negotiate, that I had agreed to mediation as a form of capitulation, a prelude to some compromise he intended to walk away with. How many times in his life had that assumption served him? How many people before me had looked at his charm and his confidence and decided the path of least resistance was simply to give him what he wanted. The mediation room was in Sandra's office building, smaller than her main office, with a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window overlooking the street. Sandra sat beside me. Across the table were Marcus, Renee, and Desmond, the 3 of them arranged with the slightly overcomposed posture of people who have rehearsed their positions. Desmond opened by suggesting that the deed restriction, while technically recorded, might be challenged on grounds of Harold's mental capacity in 1991. He said this with professional smoothness, as though it were simply one legal avenue among several, nothing personal. Sandra slid a document across the table. Harold Calloway's 1991 medical records, she said, obtained with Mrs. Calloway's authorization. He was examined by his physician 6 weeks before the filing. Clean bill of health. No cognitive concerns noted. We anticipated this argument and prepared for it. Desmond looked at the document. His smoothness did not falter, but something shifted in his eyes. He reached for the papers with the unhurried deliberateness of a man buying time, reading what he already understood was going to be a problem. Beside him, Renee sat very still. Marcus looked at the table. Sandra then slid 2 more documents across. This is the false disclosure statement made to the escrow company regarding encumbrances on the property. And this is a transcript of your letter to my office, dated November 3rd, in which you characterized the power of attorney as a general durable POA authorizing real property transactions. It is not. The document speaks for itself. My concern is whether your characterization was an error or a deliberate misstatement. The room was very quiet. Desmond said, "This is an inappropriate characterization of a good faith legal—" "The North Carolina State Bar doesn't see it that way," Sandra said. "I've spoken with them informally. They are interested." Marcus, who had been silent through all of this, said suddenly, "This is insane. You can't threaten my wife's brother with a bar complaint just because—" "Marcus," Sandra said very calmly, "no one is threatening anyone. I'm informing you of existing facts and existing legal exposure. What you do with that information is your choice." Renee said, "Dorothy, I cannot believe you would do this to your own son." She said it to me directly, across the table, with the wounded voice she deployed so effectively. After everything you tried to do, I said, was sell my home without my consent. Silence. I had not planned to speak much in that room. I had intended to let Sandra carry it. But sitting across from the 3 of them, Marcus with his cold assessment, Renee with her manufactured grief, Desmond recalibrating furiously, something clarified in me completely, and I found I had something to say. Perhaps it was the weeks of carrying this quietly, the nights of watching the oak tree through the kitchen window, the long years of making Sunday dinners for a son who was measuring my square footage. Whatever it was, it had come to a point, and the point was now. "I have lived in that house for 41 years, I said. "I raised you in it, Marcus. Your father died loving it. I have no intention of leaving it, selling it, or sharing it with people who would have put me on the street rather than start their married life honestly. You made a calculation about me, that I was old, that I was alone, that I loved you enough to absorb whatever you needed to take. You were wrong on the last count. I do love you, and loving you is not the same as being available for whatever you need to take." Renee started to speak. I held up one hand, and she stopped. I noticed she stopped. I think we all noticed. "Sandra has prepared a settlement agreement," I said. "You will sign a formal acknowledgement of the deed restriction's validity and your agreement not to challenge it in any future legal proceeding. Desmond will sign an acknowledgement that the POA was not applicable to real property transactions. In exchange, Sandra will not refer the escrow statement matter to the state bar or the district attorney's office. I paused. Those are the terms. They are not negotiable. The three of them looked at each other. Desmond leaned in and whispered something to Marcus. Marcus's jaw was tight. Renee was very still, and for the first time since I had met her, the stillness looked like someone realizing they had miscalculated badly and completely. She looked in that moment genuinely young, younger than I had ever seen her. Because real reckoning has a way of stripping away the performance of confidence and leaving what's actually there underneath. 20 minutes later, they signed. The drive home from Sandra's office that afternoon was one of the quietest, most complete moments I can remember. Asheville in late November is gray and still, the mountains sitting low in the clouds, the streets mostly empty in the mid-afternoon. I drove slowly, as I always did on the mountain roads, and I was aware of a sensation I couldn't immediately name, something light and spacious, like a room that has been opened after a long time closed. It took me until I turned onto Birchwood Lane to understand what it was. Relief. Not triumph exactly. Relief. The particular relief of a thing that has been held in tension for a very long time, finally released. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The rose bushes along the front fence were bare now, the way they always were in November, just dark canes and a few dried hips holding on. But I knew what they would look like in May. I had always known what they would look like in May, and for a few months I hadn't been entirely certain I would still be here to see it. That certainty was back now, settled and solid, and I held it for a moment, the way you hold something you have almost lost. Sandra called that evening to confirm that the signed settlement documents had been properly notarized and filed with the county clerk. The acknowledgement of the deed restriction's validity was now part of the public record, which meant that any future attempt by Marcus or any party acting on his behalf to challenge it would be starting from a position of documented bad faith. It was, Sandra said, as clean a resolution as she had seen in a contested property matter. "You prepared well," she told me. "Harold prepared better." I laughed at that. He always did. The buyer, the one who had withdrawn from the transaction, was a young couple, a teacher and a physical therapist, Sandra had mentioned at some point, who had spent 6 weeks with the house already in their minds, planning. I felt something for them, genuinely, some sympathy for a disappointment they hadn't deserved. They'd had nothing to do with Marcus's scheming and had lost months because of it. I hoped they found something just as good. I hoped the teacher had a backyard, and that they planted something in it, and that it bloomed. Over the following weeks, I watched the legal aftermath settle. Desmond's acknowledgement regarding the power of attorney went into his file at the state bar. Not as a complaint, as agreed, but Sandra had been clear with me that if he ever came near a property matter he wasn't qualified to handle again, the prior acknowledgement would be available. Whether that functioned as a deterrent, I couldn't say, but Sandra seemed satisfied. I trusted her judgment. She had earned it. What struck me most in those quiet weeks after the mediation was not the legal victory, but the stillness it produced in me. I had expected to feel more anger, more grief, more of the complicated sorrow that had moved through me in waves since October. Instead, I felt something simpler, clear, like a window that has been cleaned after a long winter. The more significant consequence was financial. Marcus had, in anticipation of the sale proceeds, made several significant commitments. A down payment on a property in Charlotte, deposits on what sounded like a fairly ambitious wedding, and what Connie had heard from a mutual acquaintance was described as a business venture of the kind Marcus had always favored. High concept, undercapitalized, and built almost entirely on money he didn't yet have. When the $800,000 didn't materialize, all of those commitments collapsed in sequence, the way things do when they're built on a single foundation. It was not a slow unraveling. It was quick, the way a house of cards goes. One card, and then all of them at once. I did not feel satisfaction at this. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated. A grief underneath the relief. A mourning for the version of my son who might have existed if different choices had been made, by him and perhaps by me over the years. What had I missed when he was young? What signals had I given that told him the world owed him what he hadn't earned? These were not questions with clean answers, and I did not pretend they were. Parenting is a long act of hope, and sometimes hope is what gets you into trouble, because it makes you willing to overlook things you should see clearly. Patricia came back for Thanksgiving that year, just the two of us, which was how it had often been since Harold's death. She brought sweet potato pie from a bakery in Denver she'd discovered and pretended she'd made it herself, which we both knew was a lie and which I appreciated enormously for the love behind it. We sat on the porch after dinner, wrapped in blankets, watching the oak tree in the backyard hold its bare arms up to the cold sky, and she said, "You know, Dad knew about Marcus. He knew decades before we were willing to say it." "He did," I said. "That restriction wasn't just practical. It was him protecting you from having to choose." I thought about that for a long time. The oak tree was very still. The neighborhood was quiet, the way Asheville gets on Thanksgiving evening when everyone is inside and warm, and the streets belong to nobody. "No," I said finally. He knew I'd have to choose eventually. He just made sure the choice was possible to make. Patricia nodded slowly, looking at the tree. She reached over and took my hand without saying anything, and we sat like that for a while, in the cold, in the quiet, in the house that was still and always mine. Spring came early that year, and I planted more roses. I had always meant to extend the garden along the south side of the house where the light was good, but for years there had been something. Harold's illness, then grief, then the accumulated inertia of living alone, that kept the plan from becoming action. That winter, after everything, I found myself impatient with inertia. On the first genuinely warm Saturday in March, Connie came over with gloves and a bottle of iced tea, and we spent 4 hours in the garden together, turning soil and talking. It was one of the best days I had had in years. The house, freed from the shadow of the past months, seemed different. I moved through it differently. I rearranged the living room the way I had wanted to for a decade. I had the back porch repaired. The boards had been soft for 2 winters. And on the first warm evening in April, I sat out there and watched the yard go golden in the evening light. Harold would have loved it. I also began volunteering with an elder law advocacy group in Asheville, connected loosely with Judith's former colleagues. It was work that felt useful in a specific way, helping older adults understand powers of attorney, property rights, the legal tools available when family relationships became complicated. I was not an attorney, and I never offered legal advice. But I could sit across from a frightened 75-year-old woman and say, from experience rather than theory, "You have more options than you think." That turned out to be worth something. Patricia visited more frequently, not out of worry, but because things between us had grown closer in the wake of everything. She was seeing someone, a man named Frank, who taught history in Denver, and seemed to be exactly the kind of steady, decent person she had always deserved. I liked him from the first phone call, which is not always how these things go. As for Marcus and Renee, I heard things as you do in a life, through Connie and the small circuits of information that flow through every community. The business venture failed. The Charlotte property fell through. The wedding, planned at a level of extravagance the expected $800,000 would have barely covered, was reduced twice. Until it became something Renee described to anyone who would listen as intimate, and which others described differently. There were significant tensions in the marriage within the first year, which surprised no one who had seen how it was structured from the beginning. Built on a shared project that had failed before the ceremony was over. I did not wish them suffering. I wished them something more complicated, the chance to become honestly themselves, which is sometimes the harder path and the better one. Marcus called me once, about 8 months after the mediation. He didn't apologize, not fully. He said he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. I said I was sorry too. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing much. The weather, the property market, a television show we had apparently both been watching. The most ordinary conversation we'd had in years. It was not reconciliation, not even the beginning of it, not yet. But it was a door left open by two people who had once loved each other without complication and might, with time and honesty, find their way back to something real. I left the door open, and I went back to my garden and my house and my life, which was, all things considered, a very good one. And to you, wherever you are, listening to this story, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Or would the weight of that love have been too much? Would you have found the document in the drawer? Or would grief have hidden it from you? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think about your own house, your own papers, your own plans, share it with someone who might need to hear it. It might be the most useful thing you do today. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Dorothy's story. She's fine, by the way. The roses are blooming.